Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Taking the Time Students Need, 3 Strategies for Self-Care. My name is Orlando Cooper, one of the graduate assistants at IHEC, and I'll be your moderator. I am assisting Madison, the Assistant Director for the Illinois Higher Education Center for Alcohol, Other Drug and Violent Prevention, and we are very excited to be hosting today's event. Before I hand over the microphone, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about today's webinar and the GoToWebinar platform. For those of you new to using GoToWebinar, you will see the control panel on the right of your screen. This is where you will find the question box that you can type and submit to at the end of the presentation. All attendees will be muted for today's program, but that doesn't mean you can't participate. And without any further ado, I will hand over the mic to Nick.
Thank you, Orlando, for the introduction. I'm just going to get my screen here in order. There we go. All right, thank you. So, as Orlando said, my name is Nick Brady. I'm originally from Illinois, but I'm actually living up here in Minnesota now doing full-time ministry for a Catholic church that I work for. But in a former life back in Illinois, I had been involved in the Illinois Department of Public Health and the Illinois Public Health Association, doing some work on trauma, psychological trauma-related initiatives. So it's a passion of mine. I think it's really important work that needs to be continued across the state and across the country, really. And this is my small way of fulfilling a professional interest, but also contributing to what I believe is a really important cause. And so I want to thank all of you for being here today and for expressing interest in being a part of this opportunity to help students manage stress a little bit better, because that's really what we're talking about here in the most simplified way that it can be expressed. Just helping students, giving them some strategies along the way. And honestly, I think you'll find that these strategies, well, I don't think you'll find, but these strategies are in fact great for faculty as well, and really anyone that needs help with stress management. So I encourage you to take notes for the students, for the faculty, and for yourself as you're listening today. Okay. So the learning objectives that we'll cover today, I want to touch briefly on some of these things, which you'll probably have knowledge of, being in the professional world and college campuses, but talking about some of those cause and effects for common mental health issues we see on campuses, like stress, anxiety, depression, in some cases suicidal ideation. We want to understand how the faculty members can become I don't know if susceptible is the best word, but susceptible to secondary trauma, and we'll explain what that is and how the traumas and mental health issues of students can also impact faculty and in turn impact students in this, this cycle. And then I also want to talk about 3 evidence-based practices, low cost, absolutely free, that you can utilize on college campuses to help address mental health issues. So what are some causes, do you think, for mental health challenges? If I was in person, I'd ask people to shout out some examples. So I'll just ask you to think, to yourself or to your office colleague if you're sitting with someone, and just think about, what do you think causes mental health challenges in general, perhaps particularly among students and or faculty? Could it be our past? Could it be something that's happened to us? Could it be an experience that was negative that we've had that could contribute to mental health challenges? Could it be our genetics? Could it be the genes we were given from our parents and our ancestors? Could it be our environment? Could it be an office culture? Could it be a home environment? Could it be broken relationships that we may be a part of? Could it be anything in our community? Maybe violence that we see in our community? Could that be impacting our mental health? And finally, could it be psychological trauma? And we'll get to a definition of that. So what could it be? As you're thinking about this, I want to encourage you that probably most of what you're thinking of contributes to it. And honestly, all these things can contribute to the mental health challenges that we face. And oftentimes, what contributes to a mental health issue can be very individualized. It can be very specific to the person. So what might impact one person's mental health and well-being may not at all impact the next person. But that doesn't mean it's, what that person is going through is not important, because the issues we face can oftentimes be very individual and specific to the person. But today I really want to focus in on psychological trauma because of its relationship to the stress response, and especially for students being in a perpetually stress-inducing environment with grades, with due dates, with relationships, and then throwing in a pandemic. In 2020, it really can exacerbate any issues they may already have and perhaps create new ones. And as we'll find out, this stress response that I'll talk about is really the biological pathway that induces, research is suggesting that's this biological pathway that can induce these mental health issues, and untamed or unregulated stress response. And so psychological trauma is a result of a stress response gone haywire, essentially. So psychological trauma, as defined by SAMHSA, can be an individual event, as I said earlier, from our past perhaps, or from the environment we lived in, that's experienced by an individual, that's physically and emotionally harmful. And this experienced is a key word because what can be traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for the next. So it's really important to reserve any judgments we may have about, someone being traumatized by an event to you that may seem inconsequential. But for them, it was really impactful. And then the final E here, you'll see that a traumatic event can be physically, emotionally harmful, or have those life-threatening effects on an individual's functioning across a whole spectrum of areas, whether that be mental, physical, social, emotional, spiritual, or well-being. So this stress response that I'm talking about, trauma is kind of the result of that stress response that has become too intense over a chronic period of time, or it could be a more acute stress response, and where it just spiked to an incredibly high level and did little damage per se, and then it never comes back down, even though the actual event that triggered the stress response has ended. So you kind of get stuck in this toxic stress mode, for example. So to explain these three categories you see here on the screen, there's positive stress, which, as the name implies, is a good thing. So if we're thinking about children, a positive stressor might be the first day of school. They're coming to the playground, they don't know anyone. It's a little stressful, but it's also, building character, it's building resilience, it's helping them, adapt and learn how to modulate these feelings they have inside of them as they encounter a new and strange environment. For an adult, it could be a due date at work. It could be, a new relationship and wondering how that's going to work out. It could be a number of things, but overall, it's not more than what your body can handle. It's a positive stress experience, and it can create resilience, which is a good thing. Then we can get to something that's tolerable stress. It's a little more serious. So again, for an adult or for a student, it could be a test deadline, and we only have 5 or 6 days to study, right? It could have been a positive, stressful experience if we mapped out our study plan, but now we have 6 days and we're trying to cram study. So it's getting to be a little more uncomfortable, not pathological or damaging per se, but it's not perhaps the best situation to find yourself in. And then we get to toxic stress. And this is where we encounter all kinds of problems. So these are the really traumatic experiences, such as, child abuse and neglect. It could be abusive family members, in your life as a kid, or even as an adult, witnessing violence in the community, for example, could be a toxic, chronic, long time stressor that's contributing to this elevated stress response. And as I said earlier, once that stress response goes up, then we begin to see those negative consequences and develop what could become psychological trauma. So as you'll find out as I go through this presentation, the key is really learning, I don't know if learning is the right word, but building resilience and developing the capacity to modulate, to manage that stress response, and to look for the cues our body is giving to us and that are telling us that we're stressed out to the max and we need to do something about it. So another way, just to help get us to shed some common language, I'm sure you've heard of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and this is just simply put a measure, a way to measure childhood trauma, a measuring stick to determine how much trauma has a person experienced. It's an imperfect measure, there is limitations, but it's one of the best ones we have right now. And without belaboring the statistics, if you look at the orange, that essentially tells you related statistics, the blue tells you nationwide. And so to break it down, and I'll define these here in just a minute, 60% of children currently, at the time of this data, have not experienced an adverse childhood experience. And if you combine the other two bars, which is one adverse childhood experience or two or more adverse childhood experiences, combine those and you get about 40% of kids today have experienced an adverse childhood experience. And that becomes impactful when we go here in a few slides, when we begin to understand what that traumatic experience can do for a person's health outcomes, emotional health outcomes, psychological health outcomes, mental health outcomes, and more. So looking a bit more at Illinois, the previous statistics you saw is specific to children who are currently 0 to 17 at the time of the data set back in 2016 or 18. But what this does on the next page is look at adults. So this is all this data sample are adults that have already grown up, and so we're looking at those 0 to 17 people after they've grown up, about how many people would you expect to have experienced adverse childhood experiences. And we see that that number goes up a little bit to about 60% of individuals will have had one or more adverse childhood experiences in their lifetime as adults, looking back retrospectively. Again, this data doesn't do justice to the disparities that exist. A lot of minority populations and LGBTQ and other marginalized groups of people oftentimes have higher ACE scores, so they have a higher number of adverse childhood experiences, and so they're much more likely to face negative consequences of those experiences because they have more of them and it occurs more frequently across the populations. So why does this matter? Why am I talking about this? Why should we care? And excuse all the animations, but you can see here, these are all negative health outcomes that have been linked to adverse childhood experiences. And there's something called a dose-response relationship. So a person who's experienced one adverse childhood experience versus another person who's experienced 2 or 3, the one that has had more exposure to trauma will have a greater likelihood for more severe consequences, right? So the people who have the more severe mental health issues or emotional, psychological disturbances will often have more psychological trauma. It's not always true, but on average, that can be expected. So here's some more mental health related figures, and that will probably be especially true for young adults. And the thing about young adults, I suppose I still could call myself a young adult, but people, men and women, really don't fully mature, cognitively speaking, until they're past their 20s. So some of those freshmen in college are not only perhaps facing childhood traumas, but they also don't have the benefit of a fully developed cognitive capacity. They're still growing, they're still developing, they're still learning, and that can be a double-edged sword. You're really getting it from both sides. So it's when we talk about adults, though, so this would be students who have experienced trauma as children, they're 15 times more likely to experience suicide. They're 4 times more likely to become an alcoholic. College campus drinking is a real issue these days. Are more likely to develop sexually transmitted diseases, which again can be another stressor. Drug use, more likely to be on medication. The list goes on. So they can have all kinds of issues that really hinder their ability to be successful in life because of the trauma that they've experienced. So you're probably wondering what we'll do about it, and we'll get to that in just a moment. I just want to talk about, for a minute, the impact that the trauma of students can have on faculty members or college professionals that are serving these populations. And so that effect that it can have, we're going to call that secondary trauma, or you may have also heard of it as vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. There's subtle differences between some of these words, but I'm just going to consider them all the same for the purpose of today. So secondary trauma is the emotional residue, as it says here, that strain of exposure. So being exposed to another individual that has experienced a traumatic experience and maybe hearing their trauma narrative. So that strain of exposure to working with those suffering from the consequences of traumatic events. And so this could be very well 2/3 of your students, right? Because 2/3 of people have had an adverse childhood experience on average. And so 2/3, 2 out of 3 of the students that you'll encounter on a college campus have likely suffered from a traumatic event. And so it differs from burnout. This is not just, I want to quit my job, although that can be a consequence too. It's different because this compassion fatigue or secondary trauma can occur due to an exposure on one case of, like it could just be one story you hear from a student that just really moves you, impacts you. It's something that you begin to replay in your mind, even though it's not your own trauma. Or it could be a cumulative effect. Maybe you just see maybe you find yourself a teacher or faculty member on a college campus where people confide in you a lot and they often tell you their deepest wounds. That could begin to take a toll on you. And if you're not operating at your best through no fault of your own, so hearing these experiences, it can also diminish your ability to effectively serve the students. So that's why I talk about students and faculty in tandem together, because it's really this back and forth relationship, and taking care of both the students and the faculty members is what's going to create the most success in any strategy that you implement. So this is just a complicated way of saying what I said. You can just see all the different things that ultimately can lead into compassion fatigue or secondary trauma. It starts out with something good. Maybe there's really empathetic or empathic teachers that students go to, and that's a wonderful thing. They have this empathic response. But if we're not careful to do self-care and to manage our own stress, it can become the effects of the stories that are being shared with you can linger, and it can begin to interfere. You're just busy thinking about these issues that students have shared, which isn't a bad thing, but they begin to overwhelm you and begin to occupy your thoughts, and it can ultimately lead to that secondary trauma where you begin reliving some of the experiences your students have shared with you. So here's some symptoms to look for, and honestly, these compassion fatigue or secondary trauma symptoms are often symptoms you'll also see in people who've experienced trauma. So this would be true for students, that you encounter. These could be the same symptoms that they're manifesting that you'll encounter as teachers or college professionals. So you can see like nervous system arousal. What does that mean? It could be a lot of different things depending on the person, but it could be someone who's fidgety, who can't sit still. It could also be someone who is kind of despondent or spaced out, if you will. And that could be from a lot of things, but it could also be a symptom of trauma. They become frozen in an emotionally flat state because of what they've gone through. And I'm sure we've seen people in our classrooms like this. They could be emotionally intense. They could seem to things could trigger them a little bit more quickly than the average person. Wow, I didn't think what I said would have such an impact on the student, but they could get angry or they could get really emotional, and that could be a sign of trauma. You might be scratching the surface of a wound unintentionally. They could have cognitive abilities. They could have difficulty paying attention. You might be wondering, what this behavior, their judgment just seems out of sorts. It doesn't seem to make sense. And this is kind of the confounding variable of young adults and traumatic experiences, because some young adults are still developing those judgment and executive functioning skills, as they call them, to make good decisions. And so you compound that and it intersects with trauma, and you just have this perfect storm. So you can read these here. There's all kinds of things that can manifest themselves in the student and the teachers alike. And these are the warning signs, or the the symptoms you want to be looking for, not for judgment, but to extend an offer of help and encouragement. So again, if I was in person, I'd pause a minute and invite people to share some of the reasons why they think it might be important to address secondary trauma. So I encourage you to think about that a little bit. Think about your campus, why it might be important, for your teachers, and some of your answers may be the same. Why you think, what are some of the effects that this can have on college professionals? So as you're thinking about those, I'll share a couple that I have. I think for college professionals or teachers, it can lead to that, burnout, and it can lead to diminished enjoyment or, fulfillment from their job. And we all know what that means. That means they're probably not going to be the best teacher, right? They're going to be exhausted. They're going to be emotionally fatigued. They're not going to, want to spend time with students because they, quite frankly, just can't do it anymore because of the experience they're going through, the stress that they're experiencing. And these, all diminish, honestly, the bottom line of universities financially in terms of turning students away because of, that one teacher or whatever that seems to be a problem when it's really they've just been ministering too well to the students. But it not only affects the bottom line, it impacts the well-being of the teacher, and then it has that ripple effect of potentially impacting the well-being of the student and on an organizational level, the institution, right? So teachers who aren't their best can't be their best to students. And I know there's no university out there that doesn't believe in the importance of the faculty and taking care of them, and this really has to be an integral part of that good self-care, in a word. And I kind of mentioned some of those organizational consequences. So as I encourage you to be careful and to always seek professional guidance and counsel when necessary, and when you feel like that's something that you would benefit out of. But I do want to, without having digging into any trauma narratives, I do want to invite you just to do a little mental scan in yourself today, and as a point of awareness for yourself. Be mindful that you're more than likely bringing something to work, on an unconscious level, probably more often than not. There's probably something that's happened to you. It could have been something as simple as in the grocery store. It could be something as severe as at home, an abusive parent or something. It could be, your community. It could be any of those things that we mentioned. And it could be something that you're holding on to, or it could be those stories that your students share with you that just really touch you in a deep way, which is a good thing, but then we begin to wear on you and you begin to experience some of the hurt that they've experienced. And it becomes difficult for you to do your job. These are the things that we're bringing to work. So you yourself may have experienced a trauma, and you yourself may benefit from taking some time to do some of these strategies that we're going to talk about to help modulate your emotions, to help be the best you can be. And I'm just here, I just want to tell you that that's good, like that's normal. I think so many people are going through so much in life, and it's you think about the pandemic and the issues that has brought to light, but then we just think about our own personal lives and the struggles we have without a pandemic, and we all are going through a lot. So be kind to yourself, and I encourage you to take time for yourself. Don't kid yourself into thinking that you don't have any problems. Right? We all got problems. I know I have plenty. And having that healthy self-awareness, not self-loathing or self-pity, but self-awareness of what's going on in our lives is so important for you and for your students. So on a biological level, I'm not going to get into neuroscience or anything like that. I just want to suffice it to say that our emotional regulation, our ability to modulate our emotions to be productive members of society, a lot of that happens in the amygdala. It tells us whether or not something's a threat, so that fight or flight, right? It's this situation I'm encountering, this traumatic event, this car accident, this, abuse, whatever it may be. Is it time, do I need to get out of here. And that's what the amygdala tells us. It recognizes threats and it kicks in an automatic system to get us out of the threat, whether that's to fight it off or to flee or sometimes freeze, as they say. And so what happens, this stress response that I talked about, the stress response can impact our brain's communication, can impact our brain's ability to make good decisions. And a lot of our decision making happens in that prefrontal cortex you see on the screen. It's that emotional response regulation. It's our ability to make good judgments and to behave well in a functioning, productive way. It's our ability to pay attention. And so what happens, that prefrontal cortex communicates with the amygdala, and it tells the amygdala to calm down after a threat has passed. But when toxic stress happens, it kind of overrides the prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala says, guys, I'm in charge, and from now on, you're going to be on high alert. You're going to be hypervigilant. You're going to be hypersensitive. You're going to pay way too much attention to things that you shouldn't pay attention to in everyday situations. And that creates all those symptoms that I talked about. It's the stress taking over our brain in one sense, and taking charge and doing things that are just not helpful in everyday life, but are incredibly important to survival when, we do need to be in a fight, flight, or most, think about, the automatic response we have when a parent puts their hand over their child when they come to a screeching halt because someone's pulled out in front of them. That's your amygdala. And it's a good response. Your response is to protect. You go into protect mode or fight or freeze mode, or whatever. You brace yourself, and that's good. But what's bad is when you're stuck in that after the accident is over, and that's essentially what trauma is. So this is the emotional dysregulation. We talked about ACEs and how they can lead to all these different issues, disruptive neurodevelopment. Those social conditions can exacerbate the environment you're living in. It can, turn into those negative health outcomes that I mentioned, which ultimately at the top of this pyramid can lead to a shorter life expectancy. And so this is why it's so important to address it. And you may be thinking, what can we do on a college campus? What can we do to impact this big problem? People need to be seeing counselors, people need to go to the doctor, and all those things are true, but I also want you to know that there is something you can do. And I think minimizing our role in this problem is not helpful. So I think we should really see ourselves as movers and shakers in this movement with a big ability to make a difference, because it's these small things that will make a difference in the lives of students. This is just a little in terms of being awareness of trauma, but I think it's appropriate for the pandemic because we're probably doing a lot of shopping these days, but we all have those shoppers that don't seem to know what's going on. They go up to the guy that's giving out free samples of self-awareness, and all of a sudden they recognize that other people exist, that someone's blocking me out, and that maybe I should move my cart. And this is kind of like, it's comical, but it's also a really great analogy to thinking about trauma. Like, oh, this is why I get so triggered when, my husband and my wife says this. This is why the student is getting so triggered when a teacher says X, Y, and Z. It's suddenly like, oh, when we recognize and have this awareness of the trauma that's in people's lives, suddenly their behavior makes sense. We're not saying that doesn't make sense. Why are they acting this way? We're saying, I get it. They're stuck in this stress response, if you will. They're stuck in this survival mode. And if I was trying to survive, I'd probably act the same way. So I hope this first portion of the presentation has helped you recognize the importance of this awareness of your own traumas, but the traumas that other people, 2/3 of people, according to the statistics, have gone through as a child, not to mention what they go through as an adult. So self-care, this is the shot in the arm, so to speak, the antidote, the vaccine against unruly stress response. So what is self-care? Self-care, in essence, is this mindful, taking time to pay attention to you, yourself, not in this narcissistic or self-absorbed way, but in a way that ensures that you are being cared for by yourself, right? The analogy we've all heard too much about the airplane. You got to put on your own oxygen mask before you can put someone else's on. It's so cheesy, it's so cliche, we hear it too much, but it's absolutely true. If you're not doing a good job of taking care of yourself as a teacher, as a faculty member, there's no way that you can expect your students to take care of themselves. So the mantra I encourage people to repeat when I'm in person is self-care is not selfish. So if you're in an office by yourself, I encourage you to say that out loud. Self-care is not selfish. Say it 3 times. Let it be a reminder when you need to do something for yourself, just tell yourself self-care is not selfish, and do it. And honestly, in a way, it's selfless, because if you take care of yourself, you're going to be a better teacher. You're going to be a better student. You're going to be a better person. Honestly, you're going to function well. You're going to serve the people you're serving in a much better way than if you didn't take care of yourself. So I'll include some links throughout here. I'm not going to go to all of them, but if you want a copy of these slides, you'll have all the links in them, so you can go out and find these resources after the webinar, so you can feel empowered to do some of these things. Here's a great resource that could be shared with students in a classroom. It could be shared with faculty members at, one of the college meetings on a professional improvement day. And it really just checks all the boxes for the different dimensions of self-care. A great 2-pager, easy way to spread some awareness about self-care. And so you'll see here, I don't know if you can see it very well, but I'll kind of read some of them to you. Physical self-care, so making sure the essential, getting enough sleep, releasing tension in healthy ways, taking deep breaths, finding that balance between work, play, and rest, eating regularly, all these things that we know that contribute to our physical well-being, which in turn contributes to our mental well-being. Emotional self-care, know your vulnerabilities, know thyself. It's a great bit of wisdom. Social self-care, I know that's harder with COVID, especially with students. I was talking to my wife's cousin about the difficulties of just meeting people, COVID era. He goes to college, and his college years have dramatically changed. So we not only have the general stressors of a college social life, but we have that multiplied times COVID, which makes it incredibly difficult, which makes these strategies more important. And spiritual self-care, whatever religious or lack thereof, school of thought that you subscribe to, it's really important to take some time to be with that. And we know the research says that spirituality can be a protective factor, and it can be helpful for the crises we face. It can be a source of comfort. So attending to that if it's something that's personally important to you. And then at the end, there's a little checklist for resilience and questions that you can ask yourself, a little self-assessment. So the first big strategy, there's 3 of them. I'll just list them all now so you don't forget them and you can begin remembering them. But the first big strategy for self-care is mindfulness. And these aren't ranked, but I'm giving them numbers. The second big strategy that I'll talk about is deep breathing, which goes hand in hand with mindfulness. And the third big strategy that I'll talk about is active listening. And the best part about all of these is that they're absolutely free. They're easy to promote, on college campuses. It's something that can be done in the classroom. It can be done in the campus commons area as a group activity, when COVID allows that to happen again. It's just something you can share these links and these resources through email. You can really, market them in a bunch of different ways and really saturate the campus with these strategies to encourage their adoption. So let's go through each one of them one by one here. The first one, mindfulness. So what is that? It's a state of non-judgmental awareness of what's happening in the present moment, including the awareness of one's own thoughts, feelings, and senses. It's funny, even when I read this, I automatically slow down. I give a little silence there, and it calms me. And if I had to guess, it probably relaxes you a bit too. And I think just talking about mindfulness, thinking about what it means, can help us be more mindful, and it honestly has an immediate effect on some level. So there's 2 main components to this: self-awareness and acceptance. So when we're talking about self-awareness, it's I'll go through a short guided meditation to help you, experience that and to know what it is. And maybe some of you do mindfulness already, but it's really just noticing, am I tense? What are my thoughts? What's going on in life? How do I feel? It's just asking these questions. It's, what am I thinking? And being aware of that, just knowing what's happening. And also the second part is not having a strong emotional response to it. It's like recognizing and being like, okay, this is how I feel, right? The point of mindfulness isn't to solve things, it's to notice things and to recognize things. And then oftentimes you'll hear mindfulness meditations to release them and to let them be. It doesn't mean after the mindfulness session is over that all your problems are gone, but it does a great job of helping us calm our senses, calm our fight, flight, or freeze response if it's stuck in an on state, and it can begin to help us access our cognitive abilities. That executive function that I said can be diminished by a fight, flight, or freeze response that is taken over. And with increased access to our executive functioning, we can do better in all the things we need to do as students and as faculty members. So the audio on this particular mindfulness is not so great through WebEx, so I have one that I'm going to read, but this 3-minute mindfulness meditation is a great one you can use, in a classroom or for yourself, really. And so I'm going to have this link there for you. I can send that to the slides, but it will be there for you. So instead of playing that, I'm going to read one to you. And I encourage you not to put me on mute and to wait 3 minutes until I'm done, but I encourage you to really participate in this, because I think the hardest thing about mindfulness is getting started. I know I struggle. As much as I know how good it is to do and how important it is for my well-being, I'm so terrible. I just don't do it. And I think part of building that habit is making a commitment right now to do that. And so I invite you to participate in this short mindfulness exercise. So begin by bringing your attention to your body. You can close your eyes if that's comfortable for you. You can notice your body seated wherever you're seated, feeling the weight of your body on the chair and on the floor. Take a few deep breaths. As you take a deep breath, bring in more oxygen, enlivening the body. And as you exhale, have a sense of relaxing more deeply. You can notice your feet on the floor. Notice the sensations of your feet touching the floor, the weight and pressure, vibration, heat or cold. You can notice your legs against the chair, the pressure, the pulse, and the heaviness or lightness. Notice your back against the chair, or if you're leaning forward. Bring your attention into your stomach area. If your stomach is tense or tight, let it soften. Take a breath. Notice your hands. Are your hands tense or tight? See if you can allow them to soften. Notice your arms. Feel any sensation in your arms. Let your shoulders be soft. Notice your neck and throat. Let them be soft and relaxed. Soften your jaw. Let your face and facial muscles be soft. And notice your whole body present. Take one more breath. Be aware of your whole body as best you can, and take a breath. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes. I hope by experiencing this just moment of pause in this hectic world that we're living in, you can begin to see how good it is, just in this few minutes now, to pause, to reflect, to be self-aware of all the tension, these body sensations, the tension we're holding, whether it's your jaw, or your back, or your legs, or your teeth, your hands, whatever it is, and to let it all go. Accepting of it, to recognize that it's there and thank it for being there for what it was and say goodbye to it. And this was just one time. So the cumulative effect of mindfulness can be really powerful. So the other thing is breathing, and I don't mean the shallow breaths that we, or the short, quick breaths that we often take without even realizing it, but the real deep abdominal, full lung capacity breathing. Honestly, I caution you because when you breathe deeply, it can sometimes make you a little lightheaded, so it's good to be sitting down. But the research here, as you'll see, it shows that abdominal breathing for 20 to 30 minutes a day, which honestly is probably a little unrealistic for most people, so I recommend start with 5, will reduce anxiety and reduce stress. The deep breathing increases the supply of oxygen to your brain and stimulates that parasympathetic nervous system, which helps promote a state of calm and calmness. It's the opposite of the nervous system that gets you all excited, tells you to fight or flight. And this is the opposite. So it's a counterpoint to that, and it helps you with that emotional regulation. Breathing techniques can help you feel connected to your body. It helps you, because we're oftentimes going mindlessly through life with all this tension and not even realizing that we have it. If you're like me, sometimes I can be driving down the road, can be thinking real intently, and I could be listening to something, and it could be completely silent in the car. And all of a sudden I'm like, whoa, what's this tension, Nick, that you got going on in your jaw? I just realized that I'm clenching the steering wheel, and my jaw is tense, my muscles are stiff, and I just have to relax. And all that tension that you're holding is what can impact your mental and physical state. So this breathing can help you release it. Mindfulness can help you be aware of it. There's a few articles you can read if you're interested, but deep breathing, I saw an article online, I think it's back in June, it was used on college campuses to help with COVID-19 anxiety, so I thought that was really appropriate. And there's something by the Harvard Business Review about why breathing is so effective at reducing stress, if you're just looking for some quick reads on the topic. Okay, I won't show this video, but it's just a little funny, comical thing from the sitcom, maybe from the early 2000s and 90s, Everybody Loves Raymond. And it's an example of active listening. Raymond comes in with, Raymond's the husband to Deborah, and they have a little daughter, Allie. And he comes in and he wants to practice his new active listening skills with his daughter to help solve this conflict that he's having, his wife is having with Allie, and he's terrible in terms of his approach with his wife, but he actually has a pretty good example of active listening with his daughter. And so I always show that to make light of it, but it's actually a really great example of active listening with his daughter, just not so much with how he's interacting with his wife. So if you want to check that out for me, I'll do that with you today, feel free to do that. But what I do want to show you is this active listening handout. So I'm going to jump on my screen here on my web browser. It's a link. It's actually put out by Boston University. And how is active listening a strategy? I think I should answer that question first. Oftentimes, people's traumas, develop into what we call a trauma narrative or a story. And as a teacher or as a college professional, we're probably going to get snippets of that narrative. You might not know it. The trauma narrative is being shared with you, before now, and this awareness you'll now have. But students are often, slipping things out like, a difficult time at home, and I'm, having such a terrible time with my girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever the case may be. And what they're really doing is they could potentially be, sharing something to them that has been a stressor. So it could be just a stress narrative, but it could be something more impactful, like a trauma narrative, something that's happened to them as a kid. And we just hear, that's how I was raised, or that's how I grew up, or that's just how we always have done things. These little things that are kind of clues that could, if you peel back the layers, you could see more deeply into some of the things that are going on. And I'm not encouraging you to dig into those things, because if you're not a counselor or a professional with credentials to do that, I encourage you not to dig into that. But just to be aware that if a student starts slipping those things out, maybe you can take a little more care and a little more time with that student, recognizing they probably have a lot going on. They're probably in a toxic stress mode, and it probably doesn't behoove you to tell them that, but just to be a little more sensitive and patient and kind to them using these active listening skills. So that's one side of it. But I also encourage faculty members to be active listeners to each other. Active listening is very therapeutic. Being heard is really important in relationships, professional and personal, and it really can make someone stand out as a great conversationalist. And I don't tell you this to be, how to win people over, as that old book goes, but to tell you that you can really be a source of therapy for people just by listening. And listening to people requires, no academic or professional credentials. All you have to do is listen and reflect and respond. And responding doesn't include giving advice. It's just reflecting back to people what they're saying. And the act of being heard can be incredibly therapeutic. So teachers should be active listeners to students. It'd be great to train other students to be active listeners to other students. So think of like resident assistants in dorms or peer leaders that are in leadership positions. It'd be great for them to have this skill. It can be very therapeutic, especially in resolving conflict. And then we can hope that students will be active listeners in turn to teachers, and teachers can be active listeners to each other. It's also a great leadership strategy. So how to do it? I'm not going to go through the minutiae of this, but these columns is what it's called. Paraphrasing is one of the skills in active listening. It tells you how to do it. You restate the same information that person has shared with you, using different words to more concisely reflect what the speaker said. And you may be thinking this is really rudimentary, but if you study this sheet and if you start paying attention to what people actually say back to you after you've said something to them, you'll see how terrible people can really be at listening. And I don't say that with judgment. I just say that with most people, including myself, can be really bad at listening. So please don't, inflate your confidence in your listening abilities and be a good student, I guess, in this situation, and be humble and recognize that we can all do better at listening. And I think this sheet can really help us. And then it tells us the importance of why this particular skill in active listening is helpful, and then it gives you examples. So like for paraphrasing, a cue can be like, what I'm hearing is X, Y, and Z, and you reflect back what that person has said, or I'm not sure I'm with you, but here's what I do understand. So as you see it, this is what I'm hearing, and this is what it sounds like you're going through. The caution I give with active listening is not to put words in people's mouth. So don't assume things that are there that they haven't said. Help the person you're listening to uncover what they're feeling, but don't put emotions in their mouth, because that can actually be the opposite of listening, and it can be really frustrating to someone because they don't feel like they're being heard. So that's my only caution with that. Okay, I'm going to go back to my slideshow. So again, just to summarize, we have mindfulness, deep breathing, active listening. They're all absolutely free, incredibly easy to incorporate in student training, classroom training, faculty training, and they're incredibly impactful, and not just some hokey thing you can do to be more empathetic. They're, especially the deep breathing and the mindfulness in particular, are evidence-based and something that research has shown can really make a difference in helping people. So now I just want to encourage you, and any of the exercises I use today, in this presentation, I encourage you to copy them, to use them with students. So don't be afraid to recycle anything that I've done today. And one of those things, which I'll do now, is just invite you to think about what you do to relax. And this can be really helpful for students too, to ask them to reflect on what they like to do to have fun. And honestly, that can be a mindfulness exercise in some way in and of itself, because as you're thinking about what you like to do, you can go ahead and take a moment to consider that, what you like to do to relax. Maybe it's skiing, maybe it's swimming, maybe it's walking the dog, cooking, hanging out with friends, having a drink, responsibly, of course. Taking a bath, whatever it may be, lighting a candle and turning on some music, all these different things in some ways are mindfulness, but there are ways in which you relax. And just thinking about them probably makes you feel better. And you're like, I really want to go do X, Y, and Z. And just encouraging people to reflect on positive, constructive self-care, relaxation, techniques is a good thing. And it's a small way, again, that you can engage students in this self-care culture, I'll call it. Again, another great tool. SMART goals are often, used in the business world and even for, maybe learning objectives in classroom, but they're also great for self-care goals. Set students up for success. Don't let students say, to you, oh, I'm in love with deep breathing. I'm going to do it 30 minutes a day, right? If you've never done deep breathing before, it's probably not going to happen 30 minutes a day. And where are you going to find 30 minutes a day? I know most students don't have 30 minutes to spare. So what you want to do is help guide students to create SMART objectives. And I'm sure you're familiar with these, but in case there's someone that's not, I'll just quickly go through it. Make sure your objective is specific. So don't write something like, I will relax more, right? That's not specific. Make sure it's measurable. So I'm going to engage in deep breathing is not quite measurable. Maybe we're going to engage in deep breathing on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday for 5 minutes. That's really specific. It's really measurable. Make sure it's attainable. Don't say you're going to, deep breathe 30 minutes every day if you've never done it a day in your life. That doesn't seem attainable. So I would say, 5 minutes or even 2 or 3 minutes is a great place to start. And that's definitely sets yourself up for success with that. Make sure it's relevant. I will eat a bag of Cheetos every day is probably not a relevant self-care goal. Maybe, I like food, so it might be relevant for me, but for most people it's not. So make sure your goals are relevant to self-care objectives. Make sure it's time-bound, that you're going to do it 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, whatever the case may be. There's a link to a little article here, so that'd be a great thing to share with students. Even faculty members, use this for yourself as you make self-care goals too. So this is a false conclusion. I have a few other resources I want to leave with you that you can look into on your own time, but I just want to conclude this self-care segment by saying self-care has to become a habit. It can't be optional. It really has to be a priority for your life. And if you can model and emulate that as faculty members, as campus administrators, then it's going to set a really good example for the students, and it'll really help them embrace it. You really want to create a culture of self-care. I think like on an organizational level, a good way to do that is like not looking down on people that use sick time. And I'm not saying anybody does that, but we've all probably been in an institution where we feel guilty about taking sick time. And some of that guilt may be self-induced, but I think as an organization, as a college, encouraging people, take sick time. I think we've done a good job of that with COVID. Don't come to work if you're sick, right? Take time off. And being the same way about mental health issues can really go a long way to create that culture of self-care. So it has to be a habit. It has to be a priority. And it has to be viewed as essential to not only your professional, but your personal life. This goes for students as well. As I said earlier, self-care is not selfish. Tell yourself that every time if you're feeling any guilt at all. Self-care is not selfish, right? And be kind to yourself, and I'm sure you'll be kinder to others, and especially be kind to yourself as you're learning to implement some of these things. It's easy to get off track. It's easy to start deep breathing 5 minutes a day and lose interest after a week because you're just too busy. Be kind to yourself, encourage yourself, pick it back up, encourage your students, check in with them, as they're implementing some of these things. I want to just touch briefly on a trauma-informed approach, because honestly, whether you realize it or not, everything I talked about is trauma-informed approach. And trauma-informed approach is essentially like doing anything through a lens that recognizes the existence of trauma, right? So in this case, you are going to teach people about the subjects they're coming to college to teach about, but you're going to do it with a trauma-informed lens. And we do that by, as you might have guessed, implementing those strategies that help people address the trauma that's been in their life, such as mindfulness, deep breathing, and active listening. And I also want to put a disclaimer, there's so many more things you can do to address trauma other than those three things that I've said. I'm just giving you those three things as a starting point, as a really easy, free way to get started. So don't limit your thinking to just those three things, but those are great things to do to start out with. And so a trauma-informed organization recognizes the widespread impact of trauma, which I think we've done today by recognizing the statistics. 2/3 of people have had an adverse childhood experience. We recognize those signs and symptoms. We talked about the way trauma can manifest itself in students and faculty alike, secondary trauma as an example. We respond by integrating this knowledge into policies, practices, and procedures. So this is really the opportunity you have today to go back to your institution to see where we can interweave or integrate mindfulness, deep breathing, active listening into what we're already doing as a campus. And then finally, resist the re-traumatization of clients. This one we didn't really touch on as much, but there's a lot of things out there we can do to ensure we're not traumatizing people in our attempts to prepare them for their future career. One practical example of that, of like a trauma-informed practice, is having a trigger warning before a video if it's something that might trigger people who've had a traumatic experience. You know, like just like we see on television shows, viewer discretion is advised. It's that type of thing that's a little more sensitive and empathic than viewer discretion is advised. It's what they call a trigger warning. That's just an example of giving people a heads up. Hey, this may be re-traumatizing for you. So if you need to step away, please feel free to do that. That's just one practical example. So these are the 6 principles of trauma-informed approach. In a document that I'm going to share on the next page, they talk about these 6 questions or these 6 principles, and they have questions after each one that you can ask yourself as a campus, to make sure you're integrating these principles into the campus culture. So I just want to put those out there so when you see them, you'll know what they are. They're the 6 principles of the trauma-informed approach. If you want to learn more about the trauma-informed approach, this is a free online resource. I encourage you to check it out. It's more for behavioral health services, but all the principles in there, applications on a college campus. And when we're talking about trauma, it's always good to also be talking about cultural competence, because a lot of marginalized groups, often ethnic minorities, are severely impacted by trauma. So when we're working with people from different cultures in our own, it's good to have a sense of cultural competence, or I think the preferred term today is cultural humility. And this is a resource to help get you started. That's free. Again, I actually shared this resource last year when I did a presentation, and I think it's a really great. I'm sharing it again, and this is the one that I told you would reference those 6 principles of the trauma-informed approach. And I'm actually just going to take a second to show you in that online free resource. It does it here on page 15. It's only a 28-page resource, so it's definitely manageable to read. And it has each one of those core values, or the 6 principles, as I mentioned them. And then they have questions that you can ask yourself as an institution to integrate trauma-informed practices into your policy and procedures. So I want to say at this juncture in the presentation that there's things you can do that you don't need to change policy. You can just be like, hey teacher, hey professor, here are some resources. We'd like you to use them, go use them if you can. Or if you wanted to do a system level change or like an organizational level, this could be a broader discussion that perhaps you're already having at, maybe the board of trustees type level conversation to really embrace this idea of becoming a trauma-informed campus, a more resilient campus, as you might say. And these are the questions that can guide that systems level thinking. But there's also really practical classroom level strategies that you don't have to change policy to implement. You can just encourage people to do the stuff that works, essentially. So just keeping that in mind, there's 2 sides of this that you can work from. I think systems level change is always better, but don't let But, you know, your inability to get something done on that front prevents you from doing anything at all. Again, here's some mindfulness resources. Feel free to ask, you know, for these links. I can share my slides so you can have all these. And at this point, I think I'm at a good stopping point. If anybody has any questions, I encourage you to put those in the chat board. And I'm just going to pause here for a minute and let Orlando chime in if there's any questions.
Yes, thank you for that wonderful presentation. And as you said, we'll just leave a few minutes for questions if there are any.
And while you're waiting for questions, if you prefer to ask me questions more directly, I'm going to switch my slide to my contact info, and you're welcome to send me an email as well, or give me a call if there's anything you'd like to know or to ask offline as well.
We have one question.
Great.
How have you used the trauma approach in your current work?
Good question. So right now I work at a parish at the moment, a Catholic parish, and there I'm the coordinator of missions. So what do I do there? I like welcome people. I try to help them, you know, feel a sense of belonging in the parish when they join the parish. I also do more administrative, tasky things like I'm working on parish media. I arrange small groups, small faith sharing groups, and all of these things, you know, are very pastoral and spiritual, but they also have elements of being trauma informed by their very nature. So, for example, a faith sharing group is essentially an opportunity for like-minded people and even people with different views to come together and share about their faith journey. So there's really an element of active listening. And, you know, what we encourage is to provide a space for people in these small faith sharing groups to share their personal, whether it's spiritual struggles or anything else, as they're talking, you know, about their faith life and the topic at hand, whatever that may be, whether it's a Bible study or, you know, a hot button issue of the day that they're talking about. It provides a space for them to share and to be heard. And we hope, you know, I think the hope is that the active listening is happening in those groups. I've actually used that active listening to share with parishioners who are volunteering as ministers to call folks during the pandemic to just check in and see how they're doing. You know, I encourage them to be active listeners, to let people share their stories, and to make sure that, you know, we're not just calling them up to ask for a donation and to tell them how to live their life. You know, like we're just here to listen and to minister to you and to be present. And that sounds an awful lot like mindfulness too, doesn't it? So I think by the nature of my work, by its nature, has these trauma-informed principles without even calling them that or planning on doing that. But there are more intentional ways you can integrate it. And an example of that is we have here in Minnesota, where I'm living now, we have, you know, the COVID-19 protocols, as many other states do as well. And at the beginning of each Mass, at the Catholic Church, we have to read these protocols. And I made a series of suggestions to the person in charge for writing those announcements to make them a little more, I would call it trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive, as they're being read. So instead of saying things like, you know, do not get up from your seat, you know, until you have been ushered out. And, you know, please don't sing, you know, we'll sing for you, you know, because because of the COVID precautions. We can say things like, you know, we know it's difficult, you know, for you not to be able to participate in the liturgy by singing. So you're like extending empathy to the people sitting in the pews. But, you know, at this time, for your safety and for the well-being of everyone here, we are not allowing congregational singing in accordance with, Minnesota public health guidance. So you can see there's a real difference between how you say something and the impact it can have. Yeah, so great question. Thank you for asking that. I always enjoy sharing about the work I do. And does that answer your question well? If you have a follow-up question, please put that in the chat bar as well.
Okay. And you don't have any more questions at the moment, but you have comments saying thank you for the presentation and the information you provided.
So thank you. Before I lose anyone, I just want to say thank you for the work that you're doing. Even just being here on this webinar demonstrates your own commitment to making a difference in the lives of students. And I think at this juncture in time with COVID-19 and the everyday stress of student life, it's really important that we have people like you to make a difference in these students' lives. So thank you for all that you're doing.
And it seems like there's no more questions. So with that, I will close with a closing statement. Please keep an eye out for an email for GoToWebinar that will come out in about an hour after the program. The email will have a link for you to fill out as an evaluation. This evaluation will really help us with the planning of future events. It will also ask you for your CHES number, and if you do need credits, it will tell you where to send it to. And certificates will be issued within 7 to 10 business days from the webinar, and we'll have the webinar available to view on the IHEC website. And I'd like to thank you again, Nick, for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Orlando, and thank you to everyone at IHEC, and I hope to see you all soon.